The corridor of mirrors had always frightened her, and tonight she understood why. Severin walked through the western passage of Hollowir Palace with a single candle cupped in her palm and her grandmother's silver locket pressed against her sternum, hidden beneath the rough wool of a stable boy's tunic. Her braid had been hacked away 3 hours ago with kitchen shears. The shorn ends curled against her jaw, foreign and ugly. A leather satchel hung from her shoulder, packed with the few things that would not betray her. Dried marrow root, a folded letter she had never sent, 2 copper coins, and the small carved owl her father had given her on her 7th birthday, before the wasting fever took him. She did not look at the mirrors as she passed. She knew what the woman in the glass would look like, and she could not bear it. For 7 months, she had been the secret of the Alpha King of Hollowir. 7 months of midnight summons through the servants' passages. 7 months of being lifted onto his enormous bed in the watchtower above the eastern wall, where no servant climbed and no advisor dared interrupt. 7 months of his mouth at the hollow of her throat, and his rough, whispered promises that he would tell the council, that he would tell the world, that he would name her his queen the moment the war with the Iron Coalition was won. She had believed every word. She had let him mark her on the inside of her left wrist, a half-formed claiming bite that no one but the 2 of them would ever see beneath the long sleeves of her physician's apron. She had let him press his forehead to her belly in the candlelit dark and whisper that the small life growing there was the most precious thing in his world. And then, 2 nights ago, she had overheard the Lord Marshal speaking with the Council of 3 in the Hall of Antlers. She had not meant to listen. She had been carrying a tray of fever tonic to the Marshal's wife, who had been ill for a fortnight. She had heard her own name, and she had stopped breathing, the porcelain cups rattling against one another on the silver tray. Her name, spoken with the casual disgust of men discussing vermin in a granary. "The girl is becoming a problem," the Lord Marshal had said. "She is with child. The king has confessed it to me. He believes he can keep her hidden until the war ends, but the war will not end this winter, and the council will not wait. Then the matter must be handled," one of the 3 had answered, and Severin had recognized the voice of Counselor Mirek, the man who had taught her to read when she was 8 years old. Quietly. "The king must not know. He is too sentimental." "A miscarriage can be arranged," the marshal had said. "The physician is loyal to me." A drop in her morning tea. "The king will grieve, but he will recover. He will marry the coalition princess. The realm will hold. And the girl? The girl will be sent to a convent in the southern marshes. If she resists, she will be sent to the river instead." She had not dropped the tray. She did not know how. She had carried it the rest of the way down the corridor, set it on the table beside the marshal's wife, smiled and said something about the bitterness of the herb, and walked back to her chamber with her knees locking and unlocking like the joints of a wooden puppet. She had not slept that night. She had not slept the next. And now, in the deepest hour of the 3rd night, she was leaving. She had walked this route every night for 7 months, only in the opposite direction, summoned upward toward the watchtower where he waited for her with his shirt unlaced and his hair still damp from the bath. Now she was walking down through the gallery, down through the servants' stair, down through the kitchen passage, down through the stable yard, and out through the small wooden door behind the smithy that opened onto the goat track that wound through the lower orchard and into the deep pine forest beyond. She had told no one, not the head physician who had trained her, not the kitchen girls who had been kind to her, not the old laundress who slipped her extra blankets in winter. There was no one she could trust. Counselor Mirek had taught her to read. The Lord Marshal's wife had once kissed her forehead. Every single one of them, she now understood, had been measuring her like a butcher measures a lamb. She passed the last mirror and turned into the narrow stair. Her left wrist burned. It had been burning for an hour. She had ignored it, told herself it was the cold, told herself it was her imagination, told herself that the bond between an unmarked mate and a true mate was nothing but a story whispered in the kitchens. But the burn was deeper now. It pulsed in time with her heartbeat. It pulsed the way it pulsed when he was thinking of her. She could not think about that. If she thought about that, she would turn around. She would run back up the stair and into the watchtower and throw herself at his feet and tell him everything. And then he would do what an alpha king in love does. He would defy the council. He would burn his own kingdom to the ground for her. And the Iron Coalition would sweep through the unprotected borders, and 10,000 people who had never heard her name would die in the snow. She loved him too much to let him do that. She loved their child too much to let her live in the ruins. She would disappear. She would carry his daughter, because she knew somehow it was a daughter, into the southern forests where the wolves did not run, and she would raise her under a different name in a village where no one had ever seen the antler crest of Hollowir. The king would mourn her. He would marry the coalition princess. The realm would hold. The child would live. 3 lives saved with one quiet disappearance. The kitchen passage was empty. The great hearths had banked down to red coals. The scent of the night's stew still hung in the air, mutton and barley and the bitter green of crushed sage. She moved through it on the balls of her feet, past the long oak table where she had eaten 1,000 meals, past the iron hooks where the copper pots hung like sleeping bats. The kitchen door opened onto the small courtyard between the keep and the smithy. The cold hit her face like a slap. Her breath plumed silver in the moonlight. She crossed the cobblestones with her head low, the candle extinguished now, her boots making the soft, scuffing sound of someone who knew exactly where every loose stone lay. The stable yard, the smithy, the small wooden door, the goat track beyond it that would carry her into the trees and out of his life forever. She reached for the iron latch. The door opened before she touched it. Severin's hand froze in the air. The wooden door swung inward on silent hinges, well-oiled, recently used. Cold pine-scented air rolled in from the orchard beyond, and in the doorway, tall enough that he had to stoop slightly to clear the lintel, with his great black travel cloak still dusted with the fine snow that had begun to fall in the high passes, stood the Alpha King of Hollowir, Kael Varin. He should have been 3 days' ride to the north, at the war camp at Ashreeve, where she had watched him leave 4 mornings ago with 2,000 mounted wolves at his back. He should have been on a campaign that would not see him return until the first thaw. He should have been anywhere on this continent except in this doorway, at this hour, with his amber eyes fixed on her face and one gloved hand resting on the iron hinge as though he had been waiting there, exactly there, for hours. He did not move. He did not speak. He looked at her. He looked at the hacked braid. He looked at the stable boy's tunic. He looked at the satchel and the dead candle and the silver locket peeking from the throat of the rough wool. He looked at the way her hand was still raised to the latch that he had opened for her. He looked, last, at her belly, where the wool fell loosely enough to hide what was beginning to show. His jaw moved. Once. Twice. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Where?" he said. "Are you going?" It was not a question. Severin's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The silver locket against her sternum had gone painfully cold. The mark on her wrist was burning so hot she thought the skin would split. She could see, in the dim light, that there was a faint tremor in his gloved hand. The hand of a man who had felt something tear inside his chest 3 days into a campaign and had turned his horse around without a word and ridden 90 miles in the dark to stand in this doorway. Through the bond she had been pretending did not exist, she felt his terror. It was vast. It was animal. It was the terror of a creature who had reached for his mate across the bond and found her receding, walking away, vanishing. Her satchel slipped from her shoulder and struck the cobblestones with a sound like a small body falling. "Severin," he said, and now his voice was breaking at the edges. "Tell me where you are going." She could not tell him. If she told him, everything she had calculated, every life she had weighed, would be undone. She had to lie. She had to lie with her whole body, with her face and her hands and her voice, to the one person in the world who had ever truly seen her. She lifted her chin. "I am leaving you," she said. The words fell into the cold air between them like stones into still water. Kael'Varin, Alpha King of Hollowir, did not flinch. He did not roar. He did not seize her by the wrist and drag her back inside. He only looked at her with those amber eyes that had wept against her shoulder 100 times in the dark of the watchtower, and the something inside his chest that had been holding him upright through 90 miles of hard riding finally, visibly, broke. He took one step backward, out of the doorway, into the orchard. He held the door open. "Then go," he said. And Severin, who had spent 3 days preparing for every possible reaction except this one, felt the ground tilt beneath her boots. She did not move. She had braced for his fury. She had braced for his hands. She had braced for him to refuse, to forbid, to bellow for the guard, to shift into the great black wolf the kingdom whispered about, and pin her to the cobblestones with paws the size of dinner plates. She had not braced for him to step aside. The orchard beyond him was a dark mouth. The goat track was a thin, pale ribbon between the gnarled trunks. Snow drifted down through the branches in a slow, indifferent fall. "Go," he said again, softer this time. "If that is what you have decided, I will not stop you." His hand on the door was shaking now, openly. She could see his throat working above the collar of the great cloak. She could see the wet brightness in his eyes that he was not bothering to hide. She had to go. She had to step through the doorway and walk past him and not look back. Because if she looked back, she would never leave, and if she never left, her child would die before she ever drew breath. Severin bent and picked up her satchel. She walked toward the door. She passed within an inch of him. She felt the heat of his body through the cloak. She smelled the road on him, the horse and the leather and the cold and, beneath all of it, the warm, dark scent of his skin that she had memorized in the watchtower. The bond on her wrist screamed. She did not stop. She crossed the threshold. The cold of the orchard wrapped around her. She took 3 steps onto the goat track. 4. 5. Behind her, she heard him exhale, a long, ragged exhale. The sound of a man who had been holding his breath since the moment he understood she was leaving. She did not turn. She walked. The orchard swallowed her. The pines rose up. Her boots crunched on frozen needles. The candle was a dead weight in her palm. The mark on her wrist burned like a brand pressed deeper with every step. She did not turn even when, somewhere far behind her, somewhere in the high, empty courtyard of Hollowir Palace, she heard the sound she had been bracing for in the doorway and which had not come there. A howl. It was not a howl of rage. It was the howl of an animal whose chest has been opened. It rose into the snow-thick night and held for one long, impossible breath, and broke at the end into something that was not a wolf's voice at all. Something that was unmistakably a man's, and Severin pressed both hands over her mouth to keep her own answering cry inside her teeth, and she walked faster, and she did not look back. What she did not see, because she did not turn, was this. In the doorway of the small wooden gate, the Alpha King of Hollowir had not moved. The howl had come from his throat without his permission. He stood there for a long time. Then, slowly, he stepped back inside the doorway. He closed the small wooden door with hands that were no longer steady. He walked back through the kitchen passage, climbed the servants' stair, climbed the long gallery of mirrors without looking at any of them, and climbed, finally, the spiral stair to the watchtower above the eastern wall. The chamber at the top was exactly as she had left it. The great bed was unmade. Her shawl, the gray one with the small darn tear at the hem, was folded on the chair by the window. A clay cup with the dregs of the cinnamon tea she liked still sat on the bedside table. He stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. He looked at the place on the pillow where her dark head used to rest. He looked at the little carved horse on the windowsill, the one she had laughed at because he had whittled it himself, and it was very bad. He walked to the bedside table. There, beneath the clay cup, folded into quarters with hands he now recognized as hers from the precise way she folded everything, was a slip of parchment. He picked it up. He unfolded it. He read it. It contained one line. "Forgive me for the mercy of disappearing. I love you too much to let you choose me." The Alpha King of Hollowir read the line 3 times. Then he sat down very slowly on the edge of the great unmade bed, and he laid the parchment flat on his knee and he pressed his palm over it, and he did not move for a long time. When he finally lifted his head, his amber eyes had gone the color of beaten gold, and the man inside him was no longer the only thing looking out. He spoke a single word, very quietly, to the empty room. "Mercy," he said. He let the word taste like the lie it was. Then he rose and he walked to the great oaken door of the watchtower, and he descended. And he summoned his first fang to the war room before the dawn bell had finished ringing across the snow-dusted city below. The village of Brackenhollow lay 6 days' walk south of nowhere. It clung to the spine of a low ridge between 2 slow gray rivers, and its houses were built of fieldstone and turf, and it had 1 inn, 1 chapel, 1 mill, 1 well, and 1 healer who had walked into the village 14 months ago with her hand pressed to her belly and her boots worn through at the heel. They had taken her in because the previous healer had died of the lung rot in autumn, and they had no one to set the broken bones of the woodcutters or pull the breech calves of the cattle. She had given her name as Rena. The widow Pell, who owned the empty cottage at the end of the lane behind the mill, had said, "Let the girl have it. What does an old woman need with 2 cottages?" And that had been the end of the discussion. Now it was high summer, and the woman who called herself Rena was kneeling in the long grass behind her cottage, with her sleeves pushed up to the elbow and her dark hair, grown out now to her shoulders, tied back with a strip of green cloth. The infant strapped to her chest in a sling of soft gray wool was sound asleep, one tiny fist wrapped around a fold of the sling. The child's name, Severin had decided in the hour of her birth, was Wren. Wren had been born 5 months ago in this cottage, in the deep dark of a spring night, with the widow Pell and a midwife from the next village over for company. The labor had been long. The pain had been worse than Severin had been prepared for. But the child had come into the world strong-lunged and bright-eyed, and Severin had wept into her tiny dark hair and whispered her father's true name to her, only once. "Cale," she had whispered. "Your father was called Cale. He loved you before he ever saw your face." Then she had named the child Wren, and she had folded the secret away inside her chest like a pressed flower in the pages of a book. The mark on her wrist had not faded. That was the thing she could not stop thinking about. The thing that woke her in the middle of the night with a jolt as though she had been struck. Among the wolf-blooded, a rejected mate's mark withered within a season. The skin smoothed. The bond starved. By now there should have been nothing on the inside of her left wrist but unmarked skin. Instead, the mark had darkened. It had not only darkened, it had spread. The half-formed claiming bite had grown threads of silver that traced up the inside of her forearm in a delicate branching pattern, like frost creeping across a window pane, like a tree growing in slow motion under her skin. It pulsed with her heartbeat, and sometimes, when the wind blew from the north, it pulsed with another rhythm beneath her own. Slower, deeper, the rhythm of a heart she had pressed her ear against in the watchtower 100 times. She did not know what it meant. Marks faded. Marks scarred. Marks did not bloom into silver vines on the skin of a woman who had walked away. Unless she would not finish the thought. The thought, finished, was a door she could not open and continue living. The thought, finished, was unless he never let me go. Mistress Rena. The voice was small and breathless. Severin looked up. A boy of perhaps 11, the miller's youngest, was running across the grass toward her. Mistress Rena. Father says come quick, there are riders at the inn. Severin's hand went still in the basket. Riders. 3 of them. Big men. They have a banner. It is black, with a stag on it. Father says he has never seen the like. A stag. The breath left Severin's lungs in a long, thin stream. The crest of Hollowir was a white antler on black. A stag was a thing close enough to share the hunting grounds, close enough to be mistaken for, but it was not the antler of the king. The Lord Marshal of Hollowir bore a black banner with a silver stag. The men at the inn were not Kaels. The men at the inn were the marshals. Go, Severin said, and her voice came out perfectly steady. Go back to your father. Tell him I am at the chapel laying out herbs for old Cobb's poultice. Do not tell him you saw me here. Do you understand me, Toby? The boy nodded. He went, his bare feet flashing back across the grass. Severin was already moving. She gathered Wren close against her chest with one arm and lifted the basket with the other and walked. Not ran, walked, back to the cottage. Running drew the eye. A woman walking with a sleeping baby and a basket of flowers drew nothing. Inside, she set the basket on the table. She unstrapped Wren from the sling and laid her in the small wooden cradle by the hearth. She crossed to the trunk at the foot of her bed and lifted the lid. Beneath the folded linen was a leather satchel she had not touched since the orchard. Inside it was a dead candle, a small handful of coins, the folded letter, and her father's carved owl. She added the silver locket from around her neck. She added the small carved horse from her bedside table, which she had stolen from the watchtower on the night she left because she could not bear to leave it behind. She closed the satchel. She went to the cradle. We have to go again, my love, she whispered. She did not let herself cry. She had cried out all the easy tears in the orchard. What was left now was only the hard kind, the kind that did not fall. She turned toward the door to fetch her travel cloak. The door opened before she touched it. Severin froze. In the doorway, framed against the afternoon light with the dust of the road still on his boots, and the white antler of Hollowir stitched in silver thread on the breast of his black travel coat, stood a man she had last seen pouring wine for the Lord Marshal in the Hall of Antlers. He was not the Marshal's man. He was the king's first fang. His name was Doran Ashbringer, and he had been Kael'Varen's sworn second since they were both 15 years old, and his amber eyes were fixed on Severin's face, with the weary, terrible patience of a man who had been searching for her for a very long time, and who had finally found what he was looking for. Behind him, in the lane, a second rider was dismounting. And behind that rider, stepping down from a great black warhorse, was a tall figure in a cloak, the color of a starless night, with the hood drawn up against the sun, and one gloved hand resting on the pommel of a sword Severin had last seen, propped against the bedpost of the watchtower above the eastern wall. The figure did not lower the hood. Doran Ashbringer stepped aside, and the Alpha King of Hollowir walked, slowly and without speaking, toward the door of the cottage where his daughter slept in a wooden cradle by a hearth he had never seen, and where the woman he had let walk into the orchard was standing very still, with her hand still raised toward a cloak she would not now have time to put on. He stopped in the doorway. He did not cross the threshold. He could have. There was no door in any of the 4 kingdoms that could be closed against the Alpha King of Hollowir. But he stopped at the line where the rough stone of the lane met the worn pine boards of her cottage floor, and he did not come in. He lowered the hood. The face that looked at her now was not the face she remembered. He had grown thinner. The high planes of his cheekbones stood out sharply beneath skin that had gone the color of old parchment. His hair was longer than she had ever seen it. There were hollows beneath his eyes that were not shadows. There was a fresh scar at the edge of his jaw, a thin white line that had not been there in the spring. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been ill for a very long time and had only recently begun to recover. "Severin," he said. His voice was hoarse. The single word fell into the small room like a stone into still water, and her name in his mouth, after all the long silence, undid something in her chest she had spent every waking hour stitching shut. "You should not be here," she said. It came out small and tired, and she heard the tremor under it, and she hated herself for the tremor. "I know," he said. "You should not be here either." Behind him, in the lane, Doran Ashbringer had taken up a position with his back to the cottage and his hand on the hilt of the long knife at his hip. The second rider, a younger man with a hawk on the shoulder of his coat, had moved to the other end of the lane. The small dirt track had become, very quietly, a guarded corridor. "The marshal's men are at the inn," she said. "I know." "How long have you been?" 3 hours. We arrived at dawn. We have been waiting at the edge of the wood for the boy to leave you. I did not want him to see me." So he had watched her. He had watched her kneeling in the long grass with their daughter strapped to her chest. He had stood in the trees and looked at her and said nothing, for hours, while her child slept against her collarbone. Severin's eyes burned. "Why?" she said. "Did you not stop me, Cale?" She had not meant to ask that question, but it was the question she had been asking herself in the small hours when Wren slept and the silver vines on her wrist pulsed with a heartbeat that was not her own. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. His hand closed on the doorframe. The wood creaked. "Because you asked me not to." Severin's breath caught. "You did not ask me with your mouth. You asked me with everything else. You walked into that orchard like a woman walking into a river to drown. You walked past me, and I felt the bond between us screaming, and I felt your wolf. The wolf you do not even know you have, asking me to let you go, because you had decided that going was the only thing that would keep something safe." He paused. "I did not know what. I have spent every night since learning." Behind him, Wren stirred in the cradle and made the small, soft sound of a baby about to wake. Cale's eyes moved past Severin's shoulder into the dim warmth of the cottage, and they found the cradle, and they fixed on the small fist that had risen above the edge of the wooden rim and was now waving slowly in the summer air. The Alpha King of Hollowir went very still. For a long moment he did not seem to breathe. He looked at the small waving fist with an expression that had no name in any language Severin knew, an expression that was equal parts wonder and ruin. "Severin," he said, and his voice had gone strange. "Is that—" "Her name is Wren." He closed his eyes. His hand on the doorframe tightened until the knuckles went white. His shoulders began to shake. He did not weep. He did not make a sound. But the shaking went on for a long time, while Severin watched the most powerful man in Hollowir come apart in silence in her doorway. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet. "May I see her?" It was not a command. The Alpha King of Hollowir, who could have walked through her door and lifted his daughter from the cradle and ridden north with her, before Severin could draw breath, was asking permission. The asking broke her. She nodded, because she could not speak. He stepped across the threshold. He moved like a man approaching a thing so fragile he was afraid his shadow would damage it. He crossed the worn pine floor in 3 slow steps, and he knelt beside the cradle, and he laid one hand, very carefully, on the rim of the wood beside his daughter's small waving fist. Wren's hand opened. Her fingers closed around his thumb. Her eyes opened. They were not Severin's gray eyes. They were not the deep amber of the man kneeling beside her. They were a color in between, a strange luminous bronze, like a coin held up to firelight, She looked up at her father with the grave, considering attention of an infant taking in the shape of a new thing in her world, and her tiny fingers stayed wrapped around his thumb, and she made a small, contented sound deep in her throat. The Alpha King of Hollowir bent his dark head over the cradle and pressed his forehead, very gently, against the side of the wooden rim. He stayed that way for a long time. When he finally lifted his head, his face had been carved into something new. The grief was still there. The exhaustion was still there. But underneath them now was something so still and so absolute that Severin took an involuntary step back. "The Marshal's men are not here for you," he said quietly. "They are here to confirm that you are dead." Severin's hand went to her throat. "I have spent every day since you left letting them believe that you are. I have grieved you in public. I have refused every council attempt to marry me to the coalition princess on the grounds that I cannot. They believe my wolf is broken. They believe I am a hollow king. They believe, at this exact moment, that the woman who carried my child threw herself into the southern river last winter and was never found." He paused. 3 weeks ago, a peddler in the next village sold a song about a healer in Bracken Hollow who could cure any fever and who had a baby with eyes like new copper. The song reached the wrong ear. The marshal sent his men south. I rode the moment I heard. His amber eyes held hers. "They are not here to take you back, Severin. They are here to bury you." She sat down. Her knees had simply stopped being a thing she could rely upon. "Bury me," she repeated. Her voice sounded as though it were coming from the next room. Carl was still kneeling beside the cradle. He had not let go of Wren's small hand. His face had gone the color of bone. "You have been keeping me alive," she said. "By keeping me dead." "Yes." "How?" "I told the council I had received a message from a fisherman on the southern river. A body had been found in the reeds. A young woman, dark-haired, dressed in a stable boy's tunic, with a half-formed claiming bite on her wrist. I told them I had ridden out to identify her myself. I told them I had buried her in an unmarked grave because I could not bear to bring her home. I refused to discuss it further. I refused to allow the council to view the body. I wept in front of 3 witnesses." He paused. "I am told I have become very good at weeping. The court physician has prescribed me sleeping draughts. I pour them into the chamber pot." "And the council believed you." "The council wanted to believe me. A grief-stricken king is easier to manage than a king with a mate they wanted to murder. I gave them the grieving king every day since. Doran has been the only man in the palace who knows the truth." "Why didn't you come for me?" The question came out almost angry. All those nights when she had pressed her face into a pillow that smelled of nothing and bitten down on her own knuckles to keep from screaming. All those days of believing she had walked out of a king's life and that he had let her walk because in the end she had not been worth the cost. All of it, every single hour, a lie she had been telling herself while he, 90 miles to the north, was telling a different lie to the men who would have killed her. "Because the marshal would have moved on you within the hour. Because the moment I rode south, every spy in the Hall of Antlers would have known. Because if they thought you were alive and carrying our child, you would have been dead in a ditch before I made it back to the high pass. The only thing that has kept you alive, Severin, is that they do not know you exist." He drew a breath. "And now they suspect." "How many of them are at the inn?" 3. The marshal's huntsman, 2 of his sworn men. They will come to your door tonight, after the village has gone to bed. They will take you out into the woods. They will make it look like a wolf did it." His mouth twisted. "They are aware of the irony." "And Wren?" "Wren they will leave. An infant cannot identify them. A child found in an empty cottage will be taken in by the village. They are not, by their standards, monsters." She closed her eyes. The mark on her wrist had gone from a pulse to a steady deep heat, and she understood now what she had been refusing to understand. The vines on her skin had grown because the bond between them had not been one-sided, had not been severed. He had been feeding it. He had been feeding it every night from the watchtower above the eastern wall, by refusing to let her go, by refusing to take another, by refusing to allow the lie of her death to become a truth in any chamber of his heart. The bond had grown silver vines because the bond had been tended. She opened her eyes. He was watching her face. You did not let me leave. No. You let me walk out of the orchard, but you did not let me leave. No. Why? He looked down at his daughter's small hand, still curled around his thumb. Because you were trying to save us, and I did not yet know how to save you back. So I did the only thing I could do. I let you go where you would be safer than my arms could keep you, and I made the world believe you were already gone, and I waited for the moment when I could bring you home without the world ending around us. He looked up. I am here, Severin. I have come to bring you home. The moment is now. A boot scraped on the stone outside the door. It was not Doran's boot. It was not the younger rider's. It came from the wrong direction, from the back of the cottage, from the herb garden, where no one should have been walking at this hour. Severin's eyes flew to Cale's face. He had heard it too. He was already moving. He rose from the cradle in a single fluid motion that did not disturb the infant's grip on his thumb until the very last instant, when he transferred her, with a gentleness that should not have been possible, into the curve of Severin's lap. He drew the long knife from his belt. Doran, he said. He did not raise his voice. The first fang of Hollowir was already turning in the doorway, his own knife already in his hand. The garden, Doran said. The next sound was the small wet sound of a man being killed. It came from just outside the back wall of the cottage. A grunt, a soft impact, the rustle of something heavy settling into the herb beds. Cale was at the back window. He looked out. He looked back at her. His face had gone perfectly still, the stillness of a wolf that had just understood the size of the thing in the dark with it. There were not 3, he said quietly. There were 5. The front door of the cottage shuddered. Something heavy struck it from the outside. Doran turned with the easy economy of a man who had been doing this since he was 15 and braced one shoulder against the wood. They mean to take her now, in daylight. Then someone in our company has talked, Doran said. Yes. The door shuddered again. Severin pulled Wren tight against her chest. The silver vines on her wrist were burning so hot now that she could see the light of them through the linen of her sleeve. Cale saw it. His amber eyes went wide. Severin, your wrist. She looked down. The vines had begun to spread visibly, climbing past her elbow now, climbing toward her shoulder. What is happening? She whispered. I do not know. The door shuddered a third time, and this time the wood split. The first body came through the splintered door in a spray of pine fragments. Doran had thrown him. The second man came through behind the first with a short blade in each hand. He did not make it 3 steps. Cale moved. The Alpha King of Hollowir crossed the cottage floor in a movement Severin's eye could not properly follow, and the second man with the 2 short blades was airborne, and then he was against the wall above the hearth, and then he was on the floor in the corner with his head at an angle his head should not have been at, and Cale was already turning toward the back window, where the third man was just beginning to come through. The third man saw Cale's face. He tried to retreat. He did not retreat fast enough. Cale caught him by the back of the collar and hauled him into the cottage the way a man hauls a fish into a boat, and the man hit the floor at Severin's feet, and Cale was on him with one knee on his chest and the long knife at his throat. Where is the 4th? Cale said. His voice was conversational. The man on the floor opened his mouth. The arrow that came through the broken doorway took him in the throat before he could speak. It was not aimed at him. The arrow had been aimed at her. The angle was wrong because Kale had been kneeling between her and the doorway, and the man on the floor had risen up under Kale's knee in his last desperate convulsion, and the arrow had taken him instead. The arrowhead glistened black, with something that was not blood, poison. Doran was already through the broken frame and into the lane. The younger rider with the hawk had appeared from the side of the cottage with a short bow and was loosing arrows into the kitchen garden at things Severin could not see. Wren began to cry. The sound of her daughter's frightened wail unstuck something in Severin that had been frozen since the boot scraped on the stone behind the herb beds. She rose. She crossed to the cradle and laid Wren down inside it, and she pulled the small wooden lid that the widow Pell had carved for her, and she closed it over her daughter, and she whispered 3 words through the wood. Stay quiet. Love. The bond on her wrist was screaming. The silver vines had reached her collarbone. She could see them in the polished iron of the cooking pot that hung beside the hearth, glowing faintly under her skin like wire heated in a forge. She did not understand what was happening to her body. She did not have time to understand. Kale had risen from the dead man on the floor. His amber eyes had gone the strange beaten gold she had seen once before, in the watchtower, when he had told her that his wolf was very close to the surface and she should not be alarmed if his eyes changed. The eyes were changing now. A second arrow came through the broken doorway. This one Kale caught. He plucked it from the air between them with his bare hand, and he closed his fist around the shaft, and the arrow snapped in his grip. Stay behind me, he said to her. Whatever happens, whatever you see, stay behind me. There are at least 8. The marshal sent more than I thought. They were not going to take you tonight. They were going to come for you in your sleep. Make it look like an accident. He bared his teeth in something that was not a smile. He has thought of everything. He has not thought of me. He turned toward the door. He paused. He looked back at her, with the silver vines glowing under the skin of her throat, and his eyes traveled from the vines to the cradle where their daughter was making small, frightened sounds beneath the carved wooden lid, and the something inside him that had been holding itself together since the orchard finally fully let go. When he spoke, his voice had dropped half an octave. I am going to end the men who came to harm my mate. He walked out into the lane. Severin stood alone in the broken cottage. She did not stay behind him. She had decided, in the orchard, that she would never again be the woman who let other people die for her. She had walked out of Hollowir because she had thought walking would save them. She had been catastrophically wrong, and the price was that strangers in her time garden had brought poisoned arrows to a cottage where her daughter slept. Not again. Not ever again. She crossed to the table. She needed the small clay jar at the back of the table, the one she had brewed 3 weeks ago after a wolf had come too close to the village, and a woodcutter had asked her if there was anything that could turn a wolf away. She had told him there was not. She had lied. She lifted the jar. She unstoppered it. The smell that rose from it was thick and sharp, the smell of crushed wolfsbane and silver shavings and the resin of the white pine. An old recipe, an outlawed recipe, a recipe her mother had whispered to her when she was 9 and had made her swear never to brew. Only if the world ends, my love. Only if the world ends. The world had ended an hour ago. She tied a strip of linen around her face. She stepped over the dead man on the floor. She walked. With the silver vines burning under her skin and the small clay jar in her hand and her dead mother's outlawed recipe held close against her chest, toward the broken doorway. Outside, Kelvarin was already among them. The lane was full of men. Severin counted 6 on their feet and 3 on the ground. Doran had a man pinned against the wall of the smithy across the lane. The younger rider with the hawk was moving with the man Severin had just decided was very young, perhaps 18. Kale was at the center of the lane, and there was blood on his sleeve that was not his, and the 2 men closing on him from opposite sides were not going to reach him. What they were going to reach was the cottage door. Severin saw it the way one sees a card that has not yet been turned. The two men were splitting around him. One was carrying a torch that he was trying, with hands that shook, to strike a light against a steel. The torch was for the cottage. The torch was for the cradle. Severin lifted the clay jar. She did not know afterward where the words came from. They rose up out of her chest as though they had been waiting to be spoken, and they came out of her mouth in a voice that was not entirely her own, a voice that had a low harmonic under it. "Stop," she said. The lane stopped. Every man in it, the marshal's men, the king's men, Cale himself, the boy with the hawk, the man Doran had pinned against the smithy wall. Every single one of them turned, in the same instant, to look at the woman in the doorway with silver vines glowing under the skin of her throat, and a small, unstoppered clay jar held high in her hand. She tipped the jar. The black liquid inside it poured out onto the dirt of the lane in a thin, perfect line that ran from her doorstep to the edge of the road. Where the liquid struck the earth, the dirt darkened. Where it pooled, a thin, pale smoke began to rise. The marshal's men, the men with wolf blood in their veins, took a step back. They took it in unison, the way men step back from the edge of a cliff they had not realized was a cliff. The man with the torch dropped the torch. "This is my house," Severin said, in the voice that had a harmonic under it. "This is my daughter's cradle. You will not pass this line." The black liquid hissed. The smoke thickened. Severin lifted her marked wrist and pressed her glowing palm flat against the doorframe, and the silver vines under her skin pulsed once, brilliantly, and the line of black liquid in the dirt caught fire. It was not ordinary fire. It rose from the earth in a thin, pale wall, the height of a man, the color of moonlight. And it did not touch the cottage, and it did not touch Cale where he stood beyond it. But the marshal's men, the wolf-blooded men, the men who had come to harm her daughter in her cradle, fell back from it as though it were the edge of a furnace. One of them screamed. The wall of pale fire held. And Severin understood at last what her mother had meant when she had said only if the world ends. She had not made the recipe. The recipe had made her. She turned her head. Slowly, and across the wall of pale fire, her eyes met Cale's, and from his throat, low and astonished and reverent, came a single word. "Vela," he said. It was a word in the old tongue, the tongue spoken in Hollowir only by the very old and the very secret, and Severin had heard it once before, as a child, from her mother's lips on her deathbed. She had not known what it meant. She had never asked. She understood now that her mother had known exactly what was sleeping in her daughter's blood. And she understood, with a cold, clean certainty that arrived in her like the first breath after a long submersion, that the Lord Marshal of Hollowir had not sent his men south to bury a healer. He had sent them to bury a Vila, which meant the Marshal had known what she was, which meant he had known for years. The wall of pale fire flickered. Severin's knees began to give. The last thing she saw, before the silver vines on her wrist pulsed one final blinding time and the world tilted sideways into darkness, was Cale Varin vaulting through the wall of her own moonlit fire as though it were nothing, his arms already reaching for her, his mouth shaping her name. She woke to firelight. The ceiling above her was made of dark beams she did not recognize. The air smelled of wood smoke and wool. Somewhere very close, a fire was crackling. Somewhere else, somewhere even closer, a man was breathing, slow and steady, the breath of a person trying very hard not to make a sound. She turned her head. Cale was sitting on a low stool beside the bed. He had taken off the great black travel cloak. His hair was damp. He was wearing a plain linen shirt that did not belong to him. The cuffs rolled to his elbows, and there was a clean white bandage wrapped around his left forearm. In his lap, asleep, with one tiny fist curled against his breastbone, lay Ren. Severin's eyes filled. "Severin." "How long?" she whispered. "6 hours. It is just past dusk." We are not in the cottage. A safe house, 3 miles south of Bracken Hollow in the woods. It belongs to a woman named Hesper Doone. She is one of mine. She has been waiting for us. The men in the lane. Dead. All of them. The villagers think a wolf pack came through. I have given the headman enough silver to fix every door we broke, and enough silver again to forget the color of my hair. Wren. Wren has been with me for 4 hours. She has eaten. She has slept. She has been sick down the front of my shirt, which is why I am wearing this one. His voice softened. She is well, Severin. She is the best thing in this house. Severin pushed herself up onto her elbow. The mark on her wrist still throbbed, but the blinding heat was gone. The silver vines had dimmed back to a pale, settled trace. They were still there. They had become, in the hours she had lost, simply part of her. You called me a word. Yes. In the old tongue. Yes. Tell me what it means. Without softening it. Without leaving anything out. I have spent more than a year being lied to by everyone I trusted, Cale. I do not have any patience left for kindness. Tell me what I am. He looked down at the sleeping infant on his chest. Avela is a woman of the old blood. Older than my line. Older than the 4 kingdoms. The wolf blood and the Vela blood were once the same blood, in the time before there was a crown to fight over, but they parted. The wolf went one way, the Vela went the other. The Vela did not shift. They had no second body. What they had instead was a binding to the land they were born on, to the threshold, to the hearth, to the cradle. Avila could hold a doorway against 100 enemies. Avila could call moonfire from poured oils and herbs that any healer could carry in a clay jar. Avila who took a true mate could bind that mate to her so deeply that the bond would not break, even if she tried to break it. Even if she walked away. Even if she crossed a year and 100 miles and a peddler's song and never said his name aloud. He paused. There has not been a Vela openly known in Hollowir for 140 years. There may have been others. Hidden. Walking among us under other names. I know now there was at least one. Severin's hand tightened on the blanket. My mother. Your mother was Vela. I do not know if she ever woke into the gift fully. I think she suspected what she was. I think she taught you the recipe for the moonfire because she knew you might need it and she did not want you to know why. The Vila gift can sleep for a generation and wake in the daughter who needs it most. He looked at the silver trace on her wrist. It woke in you the night I marked you. The bond pulled the blood up. It has been growing in you ever since. And the Marshal knew. The Marshal has known since you came into the palace as a girl of 15, and he saw the small mark behind your left ear that you have always thought was a freckle. The Vela mark. He recognized it because his grandfather had hunted the last known Vela of Hollowir to her death in the southern marshes 140 years ago, and the Marshal's family has kept the records of that hunt as a private heirloom, and the Marshal has spent his life waiting for the bloodline to surface again so that he could finish the work his grandfather began. He thought he had finished it once, the night your mother died. He did not know she had left a daughter behind. He let me near you. He arranged for you to be near me. He could not kill you outright. A Vela killed without cause leaves a curse on the land that lasts 7 generations. He needed you to be killed with cause. He needed you to be a problem. So he allowed you to be brought into the palace as a physician, and he watched, and he waited. And when I fell in love with you and got you with child, he had his cause. And you? Did you know? No. I did not know what you were, Severin. I knew what I felt. I did not know that the bond was Vela work. I did not know the Marshal's father had hunted your mother to her death the night you were born. I knew only that you were mine, and that something in the kingdom wanted you dead for it, and that I would tear the world apart before I let it have you. You knew you would tear the world apart, and you let me walk into the orchard anyway. Yes. Why? Because tearing the world apart would have killed you, And I would rather spend a year keeping you dead in my own court than spend 1 hour holding your body in my arms, because I had been too proud to let you go. Her eyes filled. Cale. Yes. I do not know how to come back. He laid one large hand, very gently, over the small back of his sleeping daughter. You do not have to know. You only have to come. A soft knock came at the door. It was Hesper Doone, a small woman of perhaps 60 with iron-gray hair plaited tight against her skull. My lord. Doran has returned. He says he must tell you alone. He says it concerns the company that rode south with you. Cale's face changed. It changed in a way Severin had not seen before. Something went very still behind his eyes. I will come to him. He rose. He carried Wren to the bed and laid her into the curve of Severin's body. He bent. He pressed his mouth against Severin's forehead, briefly, fiercely. What is it? She whispered. I do not know yet, but I told you, an hour ago, that someone in our company had talked. I think Doran has just learned who. He went out, and the door closed behind him. Severin lay very still, with her sleeping daughter tucked into the curve of her body, and she listened to the murmur of two men's voices in the next room, and she waited. It came sooner than she expected. It was Cale's voice. It was not loud. Mirek. The name fell through the wall like a stone. Counselor Mirek. The man who had taught her to read when she was 8 years old. The man whose voice she had heard in the Hall of Antlers 3 days before she fled, agreeing that the matter must be handled quietly. The man who, somehow, had ridden south with her king, and who had spent the journey betraying her to the Marshal 1 mile at a time. Severin pressed her face into Wren's dark hair, and she did not cry, because she had no tears left for the men who had taught her to read. The voices in the next room rose and then dropped again. By the time the door opened, Severin had become someone slightly different from the woman who had lain down 2 hours ago. Cale came in alone. He went to the small window and stood looking out at the dusk, with his back to her. How long has he been against me? She said quietly. Years. Mirek has been the Marshal's man for 19 years, since before I took the throne. He was placed in the king's household as a tutor when I was a boy. He was loyal to the Lord Marshal's family, and he had been since the year my mother chose to marry into Hollowir instead of into the Marshal's house, which was the older insult I did not know existed. He turned from the window. Mirek rode south with us because Doran trusted him. Doran trusted him because I trusted him. I trusted him because he taught me to read. A muscle moved in his jaw. He has been carrying messages back to the Marshal at every village we stopped in. He told the Marshal where you were. He told the Marshal that I had ridden personally, which is why the men in your lane were not 3, but 8. The Marshal had time to send the second wave because Mirek bought him the time. Where is Mirek now? Bound. In the cellar of this house. Alive. Alive. Why? Because I wanted you to choose, whether he lives or dies. The man taught you to read, Severin. The man held your hand when you were 8 years old and afraid of the sound of the wolves in the courtyard. He has betrayed you. He has betrayed me. He has spent 19 years pretending to love both of us, and he has put your child in the path of a poisoned arrow. By every law of Hollowir, I am within my rights to break his neck on the cellar stairs. I will not do it without your word. Severin sat up very slowly. Wren stirred and settled. The silver vines on her wrist pulsed once, gently, as though something deep in her had heard the question and was waiting. Take me to him. He did not argue. He helped her up. Hesper Doone took the infant with the practiced hands of a woman who had raised 10 of her own. Cale wrapped a heavy shawl around Severin's shoulders. He took her hand, and he led her down the steep wooden steps into the cellar. The cellar was small and dry and smelled of stored apples. A single oil lamp burned on a hook in the rafter. Doran Ashbringer stood at the foot of the stair with his arms folded. The man tied to the wooden chair in the center of the room was Counselor Mirek. He was older than she remembered. He had the loose gray skin of a man who had not been sleeping. His hair, the long iron gray hair he had always worn tied at the nape of his neck with a black ribbon, had come loose. There was a thin trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth where Doran had silenced him on the way down the stairs. He began to weep when he saw her. Severin. Oh, child. Oh, my dear child. She did not answer him at once. She walked slowly around the chair. She finished her circle and stopped in front of him. Why? He shook his head. The tears were running freely down the lines of his face. You will not understand. I will understand exactly. I am very good at understanding, Mirek. You taught me. He flinched. The marshal would have killed my sister. My sister, Severin. She has 3 children. He has held them over me for 19 years. He told me when you were a child that you would one day be a problem, and that when the day came I would tell him the shape of the problem, and if I did not, my sister and her children would be found in a ditch outside the south gate. You knew what I was? I suspected. I did not know. Not for certain. Not until the night the king marked you and you came to the kitchen the next morning with the flush of it on your throat, and I saw, for 1/2 of 1 heartbeat, the silver under your skin. I went to the marshal that night. So you told him to kill me. I told him to send you away. I begged him. I said the convent. I said the southern marshes. He agreed. In front of me. He did not mean it. I did not know. I swear to you, I did not know. She looked at him for a long time. She was not the woman who had walked out of the orchard. That woman would have wept with him. That woman would have understood. That woman had been raised by a kind tutor and had a soft place in her chest where his name lived, and that woman was, she discovered now, very simply gone. What was left of her looked at the weeping man in the chair with an attention that was almost gentle, the way a physician looks at a wound she has decided cannot be saved. Mirek, you stood in the Hall of Antlers 3 days before I fled, and you agreed that the matter must be handled quietly. I heard you. You did not beg him. You did not say the convent. You said the king will refuse. He is too sentimental. And you said it in the voice of a man making a clever observation to colleagues. I have heard that voice from you 1,000 times. You used it when you taught me my numbers. I would know it in the dark. His face did not crumple. The weeping did not stop, but something behind it went still. You have lied to me twice tonight. I do not know how many other times you have lied to me in the 19 years you have known my name. I have decided that I do not need to know. She turned to Kale. She did not need to speak. Doran, my lord, take Counselor Mirek into the woods. He is to be given the hour of prayer that any man of Hollowir is owed before judgment. Then he is to be returned to the earth quietly and without ceremony. He is not to be brought back to the city. He is not to be named in any record. The kingdom will be told that he died of fever on the southern road. His sister and her children will be moved tonight to the protection of my house, and they will be told that he died bravely, and they will believe it, because there is no kindness left to give them, and that one is small. Doran inclined his head. My lord, Mirek, you will not look at her again. Not once. Not on the stair. Not in the wood. Not in the last second of your life. You have used your last look. He took Severin's hand. He led her up the cellar stair without another word, and behind them Doran Ashbringer cut the ropes from the wooden chair and lifted Counselor Mirek to his feet, and the old man kept his eyes fixed on the floor. At the top of the stair, Severin stopped. She turned to Kale in the small dim hallway, and she lifted his hand, and she pressed her mouth against the inside of his wrist, where the answering mark had been waiting for her since the orchard. Take me home. Yes. Tonight. Yes. And Kale, when we get there, the marshal does not see another sunrise. His amber eyes had gone the color of beaten gold, and beneath the gold was something quiet and absolute, that she finally recognized as her own reflection. "No," he said softly. "He does not." They rode for 3 days. They did not ride the road. The road was watched. They rode the old shepherd tracks that Hesperdune's son knew by heart, the ones that wound through the high country where there was no inn for 40 miles. Doran rode point. The young man with the hawk on his shoulder, whose name Severin learned was Torin, rode rear. Cale rode at the center with Ren strapped against his chest in a sling Hesper had made, and Severin riding pillion behind him with her cheek against his back and her arms locked around his ribs. They did not speak much. There was only the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, and the steady warmth of the small body against his chest, and the steady beat of 2 hearts under one cloak. On the 3rd evening they came over a low ridge and Hollowir lay below them in the long blue dusk. Severin had not seen the city in well over a year. She had not let herself imagine the white stone of the keep at the center, the dark line of the orchard to the west where she had walked out of his life on a winter night. The watchtower above the eastern wall. The watchtower was lit. Even at this distance, even in the dusk, she could see the small, steady gleam of lamplight in the highest window. He had kept the lamp burning. Every evening he had climbed the spiral stair and lit the lamp in the chamber where his mate had been brought to him in secret, and he had kept it burning all night, so that anyone looking up from the city below would believe it was the king sitting alone with his grief. It had not been only a lie for the council. It had been a small, steady act of faith against the dark. Severin pressed her face into the back of Cale's cloak and did not speak. They did not enter the city by the main road. Doran took them around to the eastern wall, to a postern gate that Severin had never known existed, set into the stone beneath a screen of hanging ivy. 2 of Cale's sworn men were waiting there. They opened the gate without a word and closed it behind the small party, and the city of Hollowir swallowed them. They moved through the back lanes of the lower city with the cloaks pulled up, and the horses left at a stable Severin did not recognize. They climbed a narrow servant's stair that Severin had walked 100 times in the opposite direction. They came up into the long gallery of mirrors, and Severin walked through it now with Ren in her arms, and this time she looked. She looked into every mirror as she passed it. The woman who looked back at her was thinner than the woman who had fled, and her hair was shorter, and there were silver vines tracing the side of her throat under the collar of her traveling gown. She looked, she thought, like a woman who had been somewhere and come back. The chamber at the top of the watchtower stair was exactly as she had left it. He had not let anyone touch the room. The bed was unmade in the same shape it had been unmade on the last morning he had held her in it. Her gray shawl was still folded on the chair by the window. The clay cup with the long evaporated dregs of cinnamon tea still sat on the bedside table. The small carved horse on the windowsill was the only thing missing, and that was because it was in the satchel slung over her own shoulder. She set the satchel on the table. She took out the carved horse. She put it back on the windowsill, exactly where it had been. Behind her, Cale made a small sound, the sound of a man who had not realized until that instant that he had been waiting to see her hand do exactly that. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "tomorrow." He came up behind her at the window. He laid his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and his arms came around her, and Ren slept on between them. Tomorrow, in the Hall of Antlers, the council would convene. The Lord Marshal would take his customary seat. The king would come down from the watchtower in the black ceremonial coat, with the white antler stitched at the breast, the coat he had not worn in over a year. He would walk into the hall alone. He would speak for 1 minute. He would say only one sentence. He would say, "Bring her in." But that was tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time in all that long time, the man tasked with bringing the king his evening tray was told by Hesperdoon, who had come ahead of them, that he could go to bed early. The king would not be needing tea tonight. The Lord Marshal of Hollowir was a creature of small habits. He rose at the same hour every morning. He took black bread and weak ale at the same long table in the same alcove of the lower hall. He walked to the Hall of Antlers by the same passage at the same hour, and on the morning of the council session he was always the first man through the doors. He arrived first that morning. He did not arrive first the way he had arrived first for 19 years. The hall, when he stepped into it, was already lit. The long pine tar torches in the iron sconces were already burning. The tall double doors at the far end of the hall were closed. The carved chair at the head of the long table, the chair the king had not sat in for a full session in over a year, had been polished. Its arms gleamed. The marshal stopped just inside the door. He understood, in the half-second between his boot striking the stone and his mind catching up to what his eyes were telling him, that something was wrong. He was already turning when Doran Ashbringer stepped out of the alcove behind him. "My Lord Marshal." His voice was very quiet. He did not raise the long knife in his hand. He did not need to. Behind Doran, two of the king's sworn men closed the door of the Hall of Antlers and slid the iron bar across it. The marshal did not run. He had lived his life as a man who did not run. He turned, slowly, and he walked toward the carved chair at the head of the long table. He stopped 3 paces from it. He folded his gloved hands in front of him. "So," he said. The double doors at the far end of the hall opened. Cale came through them. He was dressed in the black ceremonial coat with the white antler stitched at the breast. He walked the long aisle with the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. He stopped behind the carved chair. He laid one hand on its high back. "My Lord Marshal." "My king, you sent 5 men south. I sent 3. You sent 5. They are dead in a lane behind the mill in a village called Brackenhollow. So is your huntsman. So is the 17-year-old boy you sent because he was small enough to climb through the back window of the cottage without being heard." The marshal's jaw moved. "You were ill-informed, my king." "I was perfectly informed. Counselor Mirek had been informing me of every step of your operation for the last 6 days. He did not know he was informing me. He thought he was informing you." The man Doran left in the wood with him for the hour of prayer was very kind. He let Mirek believe, until the last minute, that the message he had sent ahead would reach you in time. The marshal's gloved hands tightened. "You will not find proof in his pouches." "I do not need proof in his pouches. The council is not in session, my Lord Marshal. The bar is across the door. By the time the council is in session, this conversation will be finished." He paused. "You will tell me that your grandfather hunted the last known Vela of Hollowir to her death in the southern marshes 140 years ago. You will tell me that your father finished what your grandfather could not. The night a healer of the northern provinces died of her wounds in a lying-in chamber that had been promised her as a sanctuary. You will tell me that you recognize the small mark behind the left ear of a 15-year-old girl who came into my palace as a physician's apprentice. You will tell me that you arranged for her to be near me, and that you watched, and that you waited, and that, when the moment came, you sent men south to silence her in her sleep and let me think a wolf had done it." The marshal lifted his chin. "And if I do not tell you, then I will tell the council in your place. I will tell them tomorrow. I will tell them every morning for the rest of their lives, and I will let them watch what I do to you in front of them, so that no man of Hollowir ever forgets what happens to a marshal who lays a hand on a Vila's child." The word landed. The marshal had been a clever man for 61 years. He understood. In the moment Cale said the word Vela in the Hall of Antlers in front of a witness that the king had not come into this room to ask for a confession. He had come to give a sentence. He drew himself up. "The girl is dead." "She is not." "My king, the girl is dead. The fishermen on the southern river found her body in the reeds. You buried her yourself." "Yes," Kyle said. "I did. I buried her so well that she walked out of her grave and came home." "Doran, open the back doors." Doran crossed the hall. He went to the small servant's door behind the alcove, the door Severin had passed through 10,000 times when she was a girl carrying trays and bandages. He opened it. Severin walked through. She walked alone. Wren had been left in the watchtower with Hesperdoon. Severin had wanted, for this one moment of her life, her arms to be empty. She had dressed in a long, high-collared gown of pale gray wool, the kind a healer might wear, the kind she had worn every day of her time in the palace before the orchard. The silver vines under the skin of her throat caught the torchlight as she walked down the long aisle, glowing faintly through where the high collar parted. The Lord Marshal of Hollowir watched her come. He did not move. He did not speak. He did not, to his credit, attempt to lie. He looked at the silver vines, and he looked at her face, and Severin saw, in the small final tightening of his gloved hands, that he had finally understood the size of the thing he had spent 19 years setting himself against. She walked the length of the hall. She stopped 3 paces from him. "My Lord Marshal, Mistress Severin, you sent men to harm my daughter in her cradle." "Yes." "You knew what I was?" "Yes." "How long?" 19 years. She inclined her head, very slightly. "Then I have one question for you, and I would like you to answer it truthfully, because it is the last question you will ever be asked. My mother. Did your family hunt my mother?" The Marshal closed his eyes. For a long moment he did not speak. When he opened his eyes again, there was something in them that, in another man, in another room, on another morning, Severin might have called grief. "Your mother died of a fever in the northern provinces when you were 6 years old. That is the truth she was given. The other truth is that my father sent 2 men into her lying-in chamber the night she gave birth to you, and that she killed both of them with her bare hands and a cup of moonfire before the third one cut her throat. She did not die of a fever, child. She died of us. I was 18 years old. I did not raise the knife. I held the door." The Hall of Antlers was very still. Severin did not weep. The other kind of grief, the harder kind, was already finding its slow, private course down the inside of her chest, and that kind did not need a public room. She lifted her marked wrist. She did not have her clay jar. She did not need one. The silver vines under her skin had been growing for over a year, and what they were now was a gathered thing, a banked thing, a thing waiting. She laid her marked palm, very gently, against the center of the long pine table. The vines pulsed. The light spread. It spread out across the table in a slow, widening circle, and where it touched the pine, it did not burn the wood, but it lifted from the wood a thin, pale moonlight that rose and gathered around the Lord Marshal's gloved hands, around his shoulders, around his throat. The Marshal closed his eyes again, and he did not fight it, because he had been a clever man for 61 years, and he understood that this was the curse his grandfather had earned for the 7 generations of his line. He did not cry out. He looked at Severin. "I am sorry, child," he said, "about your mother." Then the moonlight closed over him, and the Lord Marshal of Hollowir fell, very quietly, where he stood. Severin lifted her hand from the table. The silver vines dimmed back to their settled trace. The hall was silent except for the small, steady breath of the men who had been allowed to witness this, the men Cale had chosen, who would carry the story out into the city in the precise shape the king and his queen had agreed upon the night before. Cale came around the long table. "Severin." "I am all right. Are you?" "I will be." He turned to Doran. "Open the door. The council will be arriving. Tell them their marshal has died of an apoplexy at the council table, and that the king and his lady wife will receive their condolences in the watchtower at midday." The King of Hollowir offered his arm to the woman who had walked back into the Hall of Antlers as the truth her court had been told to bury, and she laid her hand on his arm, and they walked together out of the hall by the king's private corridor as the bar slid back across the door behind them, and the Council of Hollowir began, unknowing, to enter. The council was told what the council was told. The marshal had died at the table of an apoplexy. The court physician signed the certificate without remark. The marshal's son, a quiet man of 40 who had been kept deliberately at the family seat in the north for the last 19 years, was sent for. He arrived 3 days later, looked at his father's body, looked at the king, looked at Severin, and went to one knee in the lower hall in front of the assembled court without being asked. He had known, he told Cale privately that evening, since he was a boy, that his father was a man whose house should not be permitted to outlive him. He thanked the king for the cleanness of the execution. He asked permission to retire to the family lands and never again to be summoned to court. The permission was granted. The coalition princess was sent home with a polite letter and a chest of silver. She returned the silver. She kept the letter. 2 years later, when she became the queen of her own country in her own right, she sent Severin a small carved bird of white stone with a note that said only, "Thank you for not dying, sister." The Iron Coalition signed a treaty that winter. The war that the marshal had been so certain would not end for years ended in a single afternoon of negotiation in a tent on the high pass. Between a tired king who had buried no one in the southern marshes and a tired coalition general who had been waiting 9 months for a reasonable man to send him a reasonable letter. The treaty was named, in the histories, the Treaty of Two Quiet Men. Councillor Mirek was buried in the woods south of Brackenhollow. In a grave Doran Ashbringer dug himself. His sister was moved with her 3 children to a farm on the king's own lands, and she was told that her brother had died bravely on the southern road. And she believed it. And her youngest daughter, the one Mirek had blessed at her christening, grew up to be a physician in the city of Hollowir, and was, in her 70th year, the woman who delivered Severin's great-granddaughter into the world. Hesper Doone was given the watchtower's small lower chamber as her own and the title of Keeper of the Lamp. She kept it lit every night for the rest of her life. The small, steady gleam in the highest window of the watchtower above the eastern wall became, over the centuries, the thing the city of Hollowir oriented itself by. Sailors on the long lakes used it to find harbor. Lost children were told by their mothers to walk toward the small light. "That is the Queen's lamp," they were told. "She left it on for you." There was a wedding. It was not held in the Great Hall. Severin had refused the Great Hall. She had refused the public ceremony. She had refused, with a quiet finality that Cale did not even attempt to argue with, the procession through the city and the sworn witnesses and the ranked nobles in their banner colors. She had walked into one such public hall once, in the shadow of a colonnade she would not name even to him, and she would not, she told Cale in the watchtower on the night of her return, ever again be the woman who was claimed in front of a crowd. She wanted to be claimed in private. She wanted to be claimed in the place where she had been claimed the first time. So they were married in the watchtower above the eastern wall, with only Doran Ashbringer and Hesper Doone, and the young man Torin and the youngest of the 3 for witnesses, and the priest of the small chapel on the lower city wall, an old man with milk-white hair who had baptized Cale as an infant, and who wept openly through the entire ceremony. Wren was present, in Hesper's arms, and she made one small bright sound at the moment of the binding. Cale spoke his vows first. He spoke them with his hands holding hers, and his amber eyes did not leave her face. "I let you walk into the orchard because I did not yet know how to save you back. I am here now to tell you that I know how. I will be the door you can close, and the door you can open. I will be the lamp in the high window. I will be the man who lets you go where you need to go, and who walks south through the long dark to find you when you are ready to come home. I will not ever again be a king who kept his queen in the dark to save her. I will be a king who keeps her in the light. I am yours, Severin. I have been yours since the first time you set my brother's broken finger when we were both 15, and I told no one, and I went home and could not sleep. I will be yours every day until..." She spoke her vows second. I walked into the orchard because I did not believe a king could choose a healer. I have learned, in the long months since, that I was wrong. I have learned that the bond between us was already older than either of us. I have learned that my mother died for what I am, and that her mother knew, and a long line of women in the dark have been waiting for the night I would walk into a cottage in Brackenhollow and lift a small clay jar in front of men who had come to take my child. I am the daughter of those women. I am the mother of this one. I am yours, Kale. Not because you are a king, but because you are the man who let me go and stayed up every night to keep me alive in the dark. And I will spend the rest of my life teaching our daughter that this is what love is, not the keeping. The keeping in the light. The old priest bound their wrists with a length of pale gray ribbon. He bound them at the inside of the left wrist, where Severin's silver vines met Kale's answering mark, and the two glowed faintly together where the ribbon crossed them. Wren laughed. The chamber went quiet for the space of one breath, and then Hesper Doone laughed too, and Doran Ashbringer made a sound that was almost a laugh, and Kale bent his dark head and pressed his mouth to the inside of his wife's bound wrist, and Severin closed her eyes. The bond completed. It announced itself with a small, steady warmth that settled into Severin's chest, the way a banked coal settles into a hearth at the end of a long evening. And she understood, with her eyes closed and her wrist bound to her king's, that the bond she had walked into the orchard to break had not, in any moment of any of the long months she had been gone, been breakable. It had been waiting. It had been waiting for her to stop running and for him to stop hiding, and for the two of them, finally, to choose each other in a small lit room in the highest chamber of the tower, with the small body of their daughter watching from the curve of an old woman's arm. The pale gray ribbon, when the old priest unwound it from their wrists, came away faintly silver where it had crossed her skin. He folded it. He gave it to Hesper, who put it in a small wooden box that she kept on her hearth for the rest of her life. The lamp in the high window burned that night, as it had burned every night for over a year and would burn every night thereafter. Below it, in the small chamber of the watchtower above the eastern wall, the Alpha King of Hollowir lay on his side in the great unmade bed, his dark head propped on one hand, watching his wife sleep. Wren was curled in the curve of her mother's body. Severin's hand rested over their daughter's small back. Her dark hair was spread on the pillow exactly as he had imagined it spread on the pillow on every one of the long nights he had climbed this tower alone. He did not sleep. He had not slept much in all this time. Sleep had become a thing that arrived in pieces and left in pieces, and tonight, with his wife and his daughter inside the curve of his arm, he had no need of it. He had a long time. That was what he understood. He had been given a long time by the woman who had walked into the orchard to save it for him. He had been given a long time by the daughter who had been laid into his lap on a stool in a small safe house, and who had, against all reason, gripped his thumb. He had been given a long time by the bond on his wrist, which had been waiting all this time for the bond on hers to come home, and which would, he understood now, never let either of them be lost in the dark again. Severin opened her eyes. She did not move. She did not turn her head. She only opened her eyes and looked up at him in the lamplight, and her gray eyes were calm. "You should sleep," she whispered. "I am sleeping." "You are not." "I am resting." She smiled very faintly, and the smile was the smile he had not seen on her face in all the long months, and which he had thought, in the worst hour of the worst night, that he might never see again. "Kale." "Yes. Lie down." He lay down. He laid his arm over his wife and his daughter, and he closed his eyes. Outside the window the lamp burned. In the city below, the watchman on the lower walls saw the small steady gleam in the highest window of the watchtower, and did not, that night, think anything of it. The lamp had been lit every night for a long time. The lamp would be lit every night for the rest of their lives, and the lives of their children, and the lives of their children's children. The lamp was, by then, simply part of the city. It was the small light that meant the queen was home. It was the small light that had been left on, all those long months, by a king who had not been able to bring her home yet, but who had known, with the absolute certainty of a man whose wolf had refused to let her go, that one day he would. He had brought her home. She had, in the end, brought herself. And in the small high chamber of the watchtower, with their daughter sleeping between them and the silver vines on her wrist, resting at last against the answering mark on his, the Alpha King of Hollowir, and the Vila who had walked out of his orchard to save him fell asleep at the same moment, for the first time in too long, and for 10,000 nights to come. The lamp burned. The city below it slept, and in the long pages of the histories of Hollowir, in the chapter that would be read aloud to children for 300 years afterward, the story would always be told the same way. It would begin in an orchard on a winter night, when a healer with silver under her skin walked away from the door her king had opened for her. It would end in a tower, on a summer night, when the same king laid his arm over his wife and his daughter and slept. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.